We're back on session number 2, justifying the cloud with John Checco. What is the ROI? So, John, give me an antidote here. What happened 10 years ago?
So yeah, I mean, if you were in IT and you were hosting all your servers in line, and someone came up to you 10 years ago and said, "Listen, I want to take all your data, all your processes,
Right.
and I want to host them for you," you'd say, "Great," but there's a catch. You don't know where the servers are. We don't even know where the servers are. You don't know what your expectation can be, and what would you say? I mean, if you had
I tell them to go take a walk.
yeah, absolutely. But you rebrand it as something called the cloud, and all of a sudden people latch onto it. Again, this is the whole buzzword mentality. But the biggest difference between then and today is that the maturity, the tools that manage the cloud or that manage virtualization and all these this elasticity of resources is very mature. They actually deliver on this promise of scalability and security. The other thing is, 10 years ago, all these vendors would be talking about cost, 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 cost. Do it cheap, do it cheap. The cloud is not about cost. The cloud is definitely about all these business aspects we talked about before. Time to market, the offloading of responsibility, allowing innovation, and more importantly, elasticity. Elasticity means that get the resources when I use them, not pre-allocate my resources.
Yeah. In other words, I guess if I have a factory, all right, making more efficient use of that factory according to orders,
Absolutely.
and not necessarily doing what they used to do years ago. Filling a factory that was blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks long. Why am I doing that if I don't necessarily
Just in
have the
time.
need for that?
Just-in-time shipping.
Yeah.
Farmers used to do crop rotation. I mean, there's a perfect example. Without crop rotation, you'd actually have to spend a lot more time and money making sure the soil was the proper
Right.
nutrients. But and it's good to go back. What's old is new again.
Without a doubt. There's new technologies, a new marketplace for these technologies, but the fundamentals don't get lost.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So go ahead.
So, one of the things I did want to bring up is that, one of the speakers at this seminar said the cloud is not about technology, it's about organizational expectations.
Okay.
And that, brings up some new issues with the cloud, with that, when you try and justify moving things to the cloud, and I would personally not talk about moving it to the cloud, but talking about all the business aspects, offloading my data and processes, and making sure my data is in the right place. And data locality was never an issue up until this point, but now there are legal issues with where your data is being.
Well, there
held.
are. It's kind of funny you get into that piece of it. In this particular segment, but one of the things that we're talking about here on the program today is this book by Stuart Baker,
Skating on Stilts.
Skating on Stilts. And very clearly, all of a sudden, you realize that the U.S. Policy on internal security does nothing to do with the internal security of the United States, but more to do with the treaties and posture with its interaction of other global countries throughout the world.
Sure.
So, we've got to deal with the EU in order to develop our own, secure passenger, program. We've got to deal with the Eastern Bloc. We've got to deal with the Russians. We've got to deal with the Chinese and everybody else.
Yeah.
And they all want to say on what we're doing. So it's not as easy as people think to just harden up your borders and call it a day.
And
it should be done, but, it's not, the flip of the switch.
No, and offshoring, which was the big buzzword 5 years ago,
Sure.
went through the same process where offshoring was all about cost, all about cost. Well, really, it's not about cost now. It's about being more efficient with your resources. But the whole idea of international legal aspects came into play because now you have citizens of other countries working on your processes, which could be intellectual property. Well, how's that intellectual property protected?
Right.
And a lot of countries now that do host offshoring sites have their legal or their laws up to par with the United States, but for many years they weren't.
Well, you know, there's the other piece which I think is just fascinating as well, and I always bring France up as an object here, because France has some tremendous policy privacy rules. All right, so here you are, you have your data, you're dealing with maybe a division or even maybe another business entity of your company.
Mm-hmm.
You're the global leader, but you know you've got maybe 5 different companies by other names throughout the world, and now you want to start pulling data from your other company. Well, your other company's not allowed to do that because they're constricted by the laws of that country.
Sure.
So I'm sure France isn't the only one. You know, I pick on them constantly, but you know, just as an example,
Yeah.
you know, where there is very, very, very strict privacy rules.
And sometimes it's very conflicting privacy rules.
Yeah. Oh, without a doubt.
And you know, it's really it could be a mess if you're not prepared.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I'm sure.
So like you know, again, you know, when we'll get into that security aspects of data locality later. But to talk about how to justify the cloud, you know, again, another speaker from Cognizant, Paul Roehrig, had stated something very succinctly. He says, if you're going to have the cloud versus no cloud debate in your company, that's the wrong debate to have.
Wow.
Because it's not, again, it's not about the technology. Cloud is a tool like everything else. It's about the business process. So
Okay.
you need to kind of look at what data and processes can move to the cloud, you know, and then justify those on business on your the business aspects of it.
Okay.
But you know, when you talk about these data and processes, if you already have a well-defined process and it's been running for years, and it's been using the same hardware, the hardware allocation is proper, you're not always buying new hardware for it, the cloud isn't a good fit.
Right.
Because everything is known at that point, all your costs are known. What the cloud gives you is for those processes that peak once or twice a year, and that you always have to buy extra hardware for, and that hardware lies latent for most of the year.
Yeah. Right.
That's the thing to move to the cloud, because now what you do is you can get rid of that hardware and you buy demand, you buy your resources on demand.
Yeah. You scale it to the need.
And then to me that's the biggest justification for moving to the cloud. The other is you know, being able to reach your customers quicker. Again, when you talked about websites, there were these companies, Akamai, which did endpoint caching, and that allowed your results or your videos to be come from a central location, but
Right.
actually be streamed very quickly because they were cached locally. The cloud offers those type of benefits with your processes and applications. And again, we go back to the mobile applications. Mobile applications will require a lot of data to be cached locally or to be within reach very quickly.
We're gonna have to have some pretty deep conversations with this gentleman because we've got some of those needs. I hope you learned a lot, John.
Anyway, but let's take a look at, you know, there's you know, what I had failed to touch on before in our first segment was there's many different cloud models. You know, it goes from the in-house model where it's a custom private cloud.
Okay.
You do everything yourself, to the shared public cloud, which is like the Amazon EC2 solution model, right?
Sure.
So you just you buy some time with the resources, you put your stuff on the resources. It's important to know all these different models of the cloud, be really well versed in them to find out what processes, what model fits your processes. And an enterprise will not have one cloud model. They will have different cloud models for different parts of the businesses. They're not going to do it all at the same time. They may have a migration path, but you have to be very sure about what fits into what model of the cloud.
That's interesting. That's the first time I've heard of that. So I'm learning here as well.
Well, I'm not making that up. I'm actually rehashing something I've learned myself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, that is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought about, you know, different cloud model implementations. I would have thought about one.
Yeah. I mean, and one of these notes I have here for enterprise CIOs and CTOs: the business is your objective, the technologies are your tools. So
Right.
don't justify projects based on cloud computing. Base it on the business advantages,
Right.
you know, that the
Right.
cloud provides. And the final point I'd like to make here is that for large enterprises, when you are deploying these cloud services, we'll get into the preparing the enterprise for IT migration next. Just remember, as these mature, they also become productized, and now, as a cloud consumer, you can also be a cloud provider. And the best example of this is Amazon. Who would think that an
Yes.
online marketplace for books
Yeah.
would all of a sudden become one of the biggest cloud platform providers?
Yeah.
Why? Because they used it internally. They were able to see the value of
Right.
using it internally and parlay that into a new revenue stream.
Yeah, and apparently they're quite successful at it.
Sure.
All right, so we'll be back in just 1 minute after this commercial from